in the Quran, but also this hadith is helpful, where he says, "You will surely follow the ways of those before you, handspan by handspan and cubit by cubit." And the companions who were with him asked, "Do you mean the Jews and the Christians?" And he replied, "Yes, who else?" Right? So as Muslims, we must have enough intellectual and spiritual independence to examine culture, including the dominant culture that we're around. And sometimes it's multiple cultures that we are around and surrounded in, and we have to be willing to examine all of that.
I completely agree with that. It's like the nose on your face that you don't see.
Yeah.
The fish in the water that don't know what water is because you're just so deeply entrenched in it, you don't realize you yourself are doing the very thing that maybe you're accusing others, you know. But yeah, so the culture is a very powerful force. It's a very real force, it's a very powerful force. And for that reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not criticize cultural differences. He does not call us to erase cultural differences, right? There's good there, you know. In fact, it's one of the signs of his creative capacity, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that there is so much difference in the world. I mean, a verse that's probably quoted at, like, you know, at every conference, you know, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. O humanity, indeed we created you for male and female, and this is, you know, what we want to focus on, and made you peoples and tribes, meaning we made you peoples of different proclivities, of different cultural expressions, of different ideas about what's sweet and what's sour, right? Not literally, right? We made you peoples and tribes different peoples and tribes that you may come to know one another. And the way Allah seals this verse, you know, in terms of superiority, it's not whose cultural dress is more colorful, right? Or whose food is better seasoned. It's in what Allah said, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the most noble in the esteem of Allah, irrespective of all your cultural differences and expressions, is your God reverence, is your reverential awareness of Him. That's the distinguishing factor, right? Amidst the differences, amidst the colors, amidst the textures, amidst the flavors, amidst the dispositions, la ilaha illallah. And He could have made it all homogeneous. He could have done that, subhanahu wa ta'ala, but He didn't. And so we have to understand that although there is tension there, the Quranic narrative is indicating that there shouldn't be. That the tension is there is because we're immature. This is jahiliyyah, this is ignorance. That's why the tension is there. It's actually the difference is there, and the purpose for that difference is the exact opposite, for us to admire and be impressed by, you know, and be intrigued by, and be interested by what's happening, what's different, what's other than what we're accustomed to, right? So we know that when Islam enters the Arabian Peninsula, when it enters Arabian society, it preserved some cultural norms. It completely rejected other cultural norms, right? And some cultural norms, it just tweaked. It just tweaked. And so, as Muslims in America, you know, that's what we have to do. That's what we have to be in the process of doing. You know, because, you know, as first generation Muslims, those born here, as second generation Muslims, you know, in households where, you know, there's tensions amongst, you know, immigrants, you know, first generation Muslims, we have to, you know, we have to understand that. We have to sift everything through the mechanism of the spiritual dimension of our religion, right? Young and old. And again, what my wife was saying earlier, we have to be very careful because we're often doing what we're accusing others of doing. It goes both ways. The affair cuts both ways. And one of the things I tell people all the time is, you know, a lot of us experience this tension here in America because Islam is still young in America. Like who's ever traveled to Turkey? Who's traveled the Muslim world? Okay. Who's been, yes sir?
Oh no, I'm just taking, no, you're good.
You're making me nervous, bro.
Just on camera, don't worry about it, right? Yeah.
Like, you know, those who've traveled to the Eastern and Western Muslim worlds, so Al-Maghrib, right, and Al-Mashriq. You know, you look at the cultural expression of people in Turkey. It's not like what you see in Senegal, right? It's not like what you see in Morocco. It's not like what you see in Malaysia. It's not like what you see in Ghana. It's not like what you see in Saudi. It's very interesting. But Islam is old there. It's been there a long time. And so it's more complicated than that, but time certainly plays a part. Islam is young here, right? And there's this, what do they call it, a mixing bowl, a salad bowl, melting pot. Some people don't like that because they say salad bowl because, you know, in a melting pot, the individual ingredients, they lose their identity. It's just all this becomes one big glue, right? But in a salad bowl, the tomato's still there, the you know, whatever you like in your salads, you can still tell them apart. And so we're all coming together here, and that naturally is going to create some tension. But Islam is young, and so, you know, we're actually playing part in that development of what Islam in America looks like. Where you and I are playing part in that, whether we like it or not, whether we're intentional or unintentional. And I believe we should be intentional. I believe we should be intentional because then we're just delaying the affair sorting itself out several generations down the road, right? Whereas if we're intentional, we might, you know, help speed things up a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, those examples of traveling across the Muslim world and seeing how, you know, of course there's a shared spirit to how Muslims are across the world. There's things that you're pretty much going to find everywhere. And when it comes to the main tenets of how you practice the faith, that's going to be everywhere, but it is expressed differently in different places, in different colorful ways, in the dress, in the food, and in the various customs. And so when we see that, you know, the question for us is, what is the spirit with which we see that through? What's the lens with which we see that through? Is it sort of this spirit and disposition of curiosity and wanting to know? As Allah has pointed out, this is all about us giving us this amazing opportunity to know one another, right? Because when there's difference, there's something to learn. When everything's the same, there's nothing to learn. So Allah gave us this beautiful opportunity to learn something, to get to know other people through our differences. And so when we approach others through a disposition of curiosity and of grace for the other, as opposed to a disposition of suspicion for the others off the bat, then we're falling into that spirit of getting to know one another. And an example sort of on the relationship one-on-one level that I think is really interesting is we have this contrast between Maryam alayhi salam in the Quran and her relationship with Zakaria alayhi salam versus Maryam's relationship with her people, right? So we have, of course, where, you know, Zakaria, he comes upon her when she's in her sanctuary, the mihrab, and, you know, where she's worshiping, and that's where she regularly is. And of course, we know the story of the food miraculously appearing there. And so he sees this, and it's important that he's the one who sees it because he is her caretaker. So he's the one who is supposed to be providing her with food. So where's this food coming from? And what does he ask her? All he says is, Miriam, where'd you get this food? No suspicion, no, how could you have come upon this? No, I didn't see this food enter the house. No suspicion whatsoever, but rather just a spirit of curiosity and wanting to know. And of course, she gives him a beautiful answer that it's from my Lord. He gives to whom he wants without measure. So that is a beautiful example of the spirit of curiosity and wanting to know another and giving people grace, as opposed to Maryam alayhi salam when she comes with Isa as an infant, right? What is she immediately met with from her people? Suspicion off the bat. They don't give her grace, they don't give her an opportunity to explain, they don't even really ask her a question. It's sort of a rhetorical question hidden inside of an accusation about, her, Maryam, we know where you come from, your parents were good people, how could you have done this? As opposed to evaluating her on her merits, which is that she was always known to be good, right? She was always known to be a worshipful person. And so when it comes to culture and then getting down to the nitty-gritty of relationships, we always have to ask ourselves, how does it feel when someone gives you grace and understanding, versus how does it feel when someone approaches you with suspicion, right? Those are very different ways of approaching people, and it's important for us to lean into curiosity and wanting to know people as opposed to suspicion. Does it feel good when we receive it, and we should also not give it out.
Inshallah. Inshallah. I bet many of us here are thinking, oh, I wish so-and-so's here to hear this right now. Maybe we need to hear it more than they do. I know we live that reality, and inshallah that has an impact. But yeah, the idea of custom and culture being this pervasive force in our life is a real one that the ulama, that the scholars of Islam have understood from the very beginning. I mean, the Sahaba, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, first and foremost understood this. The companions understood this, and then the scholars of this tradition have always understood this. And there's a really important principle, probably one of the more famous ones in the science of usul, and how law is derived and applied, right, in usul al-fiqh. A famous qaida, al-'ada muhkama. Al-'ada muhkama. So when the ulama, they try to derive rulings, they look at Quran, they look at Sunnah, they look at ijma'. There's several things that they look at, right? There's a list of things that they go down, but then they have to apply tools to understand, right, what Allah is saying, what the Prophet is saying, so on and so forth. So one of these tools is al-'ada muhkama, which essentially translates into custom is authoritative. So we're not going to derive a ruling from the Quran and Sunnah and impose it upon a people or upon a situation without also considering the custom of the people, the 'ada of the people, the 'urf of the people, the culture of the people. It's very important. It's very important, and this can be lost on people who think Islam is black and white. Islam is this beautiful, I don't like using the word, they hijack the rainbow. I can't even use that anymore. But it's like this, it's like every color under the sun, right? That's what Islam is. And so, this qaida for us, that custom is authoritative, is important. Because typically what we come across in the Quran, and even in the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are broad principles. We come across broad principles. So, for example, there are countless areas, right, in which, especially in family life and in family law, where the Sharia establishes broad principles, obligations. But it leaves the practical expressions and the nuances up to this thing called ma'ruf. Ma'ruf. Who knows what ma'ruf means? This is all over the Quran, we see this word ma'ruf. The word ma'ruf is recognized as wa'mur bil ma'ruf, and command by that which is typically it's translated as good. But ma'ruf is not just, how do you understand good? Ma'ruf is that which is known, commonly known and understood as virtuous. So it's part of people's cultural expression, right? And so long as that thing doesn't undermine the law, right, the letter of the law, then we must do by it. And we must do by it. You can't just cast it off to the side because, again, culture is very much ingrained into our humanity, into who we are, right? And so it often the Sharia leaves the practical expression of ma'ruf, right, up to the people who have knowledge to understand how culture, listen to this, how culture will now influence the deen. That's how heavy the affair is. That's how heavy the affair is. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in multiple places mentions this concept. Because what the Quran doesn't do is give us like a manual, right? Detailing the day-to-day, like lived life. Like we can't go to the Quran to determine what my wife is cooking on Tuesday. I can't go to the Quran to determine whether or not she's driving the kids to school or I am. I can't go to the Quran to determine whether or not she's cooking to begin with. I can't do that. We have principles, broad principles that dictate, for example, I'm supposed to ensure my wife is provided for, is safe, is protected, right? Allahu Akbar. Like that's the broad principle, right? But what that looks like in the nuances of that, how that's actually expressed, that's not detailed by Allah and His Messenger. That's left up to ma'ruf. So now we see how important culture, how important of a role it plays in our relationship with God, in our relationship with one another.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of, of course, people will say that it's easier to sort of marry within a culture, and sometimes that is true. And we'll sort of get to that later, but one of the benefits, of having a ma'ruf that is known is that it becomes sort of this external standard by which people can know if they're being treated fairly, if their rights are being upheld. So, so you'll often have, if you have two people who come from the same culture, then it's very easily known if one person is being mistreated according to that culture. Because both of those people know exactly what's considered custom and what's not, and if that person is falling short or neglecting their responsibilities according to that culture, it's all very obvious, right? And so that is, one of the benefits of ma'ruf and making it known, having it explicit what is considered good in a culture. Even this idea of culture, there are cultures that we could all sort of name off easily, but then there are also subcultures, right? And sometimes that gets ignored. And you have, I think, for instance, if you're, let's say, Egyptian from Cairo, that's where your parents grew up, but you live here, and you only have ever known other Egyptians from Cairo who make over 100K a year. There are going to be aspects about Egyptian culture that you're probably not exposed to, because not only are you Egyptian, but you have the subculture of being from Cairo, and you have the subculture of your economic situation, and so we see that, right? We see that take place, especially in marriage situations where you have multiple dimensions of culture that are coming into play. And even in places as close as Mecca and Medina in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they had cultural differences. Now today Mecca and Medina are only a car ride away. But they had significant cultural differences, and they had things that that the Muslims at that time had to negotiate, right? They had things where, there was borrowing because there was enough of a difference where the Meccans borrowed something from the Medinans, or they had matters of conflict. They had different ways of doing things that sometimes caused, conflict or difficulties to resolve. And then, of course, they also had wonderful and beautiful instances of coexistence. And that was the majority of it, of course. But one area in which there was a cultural difference between Mecca and Medina was for women, right? Women in Mecca and Medina, they were different in some significant ways, right? So women in Mecca were known to be sort of more shy, more subdued, not outspoken, whereas women of Medina were known to be quite outspoken, outspoken in public, outspoken in their home, having their say, etc. And sometimes that was an area of difficulty for those cultures to sort through. So we actually have, almost a little historical data point from Umar radiallahu anhu, where he's talking to another companion about, part of his experience in Medina. And one thing that he says is, we, the people of Quraysh, used to dominate our women. When we came to the Ansar, we found them to be a people whose women prevailed over them. So our women began adopting the ways of the women of the Ansar. So this is sort of, to me, a really
He didn't like that.
He was, at least not at first. So, this is a really interesting, area of cultural difference between a group of people who are both Arab, they're, both from the same pretty small region, and yet they've developed their own ways of being, their own ways of living. And, at points it caused tension, and at other points it was a sort of a beautiful learning opportunity, and we even have the Prophet ﷺ, he praised the women of the Ansar, and he praised them for this exact quality of them being outspoken. And he said, the best of women are the women of the Ansar because shyness did not prevent them from learning their religion. So you had this quality that they had that was different from the quality of the Meccan women that in some areas caused issues of contention and tension when those two cultures met. But in another way, ended up being this really beautiful and helpful thing, ultimately, that these women were not shy about being inquisitive and learning their religion. Whereas the Meccan women had to learn to ask so that they could better themselves.
You know what that reminds me of? Remember this was some years ago, but we had a trip to Morocco, and we ended up in the Atlas Mountains, and there was a unique Berber tribe up there. So there wasn't a man in sight. There was not till the very end. And these women, I mean, mashallah, they were running things. They were running the show. I mean, they were, they had these babies strapped to their back, into their hips, and they're, climbing these mountains, and then they're, they got bales of wool. I think perhaps hay, but I remember the wool because they're carpets. They're weaving carpets, and these women are, engaging with me like very openly, matter of factly, like, hey, why don't you stay with us? And like, and I'm half Moroccan, so I know how conservative Moroccan culture can be. Yet here we are in the mountains with these Berber women who are very much Muslim, but completely different cultural expectations than what I had been accustomed to in the cities, for example. And where are their men? Well, they're off somewhere, tending to the sheep.
Yeah.
And that's primarily their function, the sheep, and grazing them and making sure they're moved about. But these women, they're raising the kids, they're bringing in real money with the carpet business, the wool carpet business. They are the ones making the decision to open their homes up to us. But meanwhile, there's all this stuff happening. They're the ones making the business decisions, because when we were not necessarily haggling, but trying to figure out, like, hey, what is it going to take for us to take some of these carpets home? They're the bosses. They're making, so very interesting. We got to experience that.
It's a great indication of what you were saying earlier about, alhamdulillah, Allah gives us so many principles with which we can live our lives. But if the Quran were to say, absolutely every detail of how we live our lives, how big would the book be, right? And how many, and then we would just ignore it anyway because it would be 5,000 pages long. So what would even be the point? But the way that we manifest and live out those principles, that's up to us as long as we measure it according to the principles.
One thing we have to guard against with all of this is what the Prophet termed asabiya, or what's termed in Arabic asabiya, which is essentially like tribalism, and where adherence and proclivity to one's culture is so dominant that you don't want to hear it. You don't want to taste it, you don't want to hear it, you don't want to smell it because it's not mine. It's not what I'm used to. You begin to look down on everyone else and it fills you with a sense of superiority and arrogance. We sort of touched on this at the outset, but the Prophet warned against it, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, tribalism. We were talking about the story earlier. Musa alayhi salam, he flees Egypt. This is before he's a prophet, alayhi salam, and he meets Shu'aib, alayhi salam. And what does Shu'aib tell him? He says, I'll give you one of my daughters, but what's the condition? That you serve me for 8 years. And I was telling my wife, I said, look, I know Sharia is different, but I'm not familiar with any religious ruling from the Christians or the traditional Christians, original Christians or Jews, that dictate the matter has to go to the father, Like, can you imagine Musa saying, no, that's not my that's not how I understand this affair to be, and I'll marry your daughter, but I'm not going to serve you for 8 years. What does he do? He actually submits to that request. Now, he's a servant, with this man, and he's serving him and working for him. So imagine Musa coming at Shu'aib with asabiya, with tribalism. No, that's not how we do it. It's a give and take relationship. Remember, your nose is on your face. You don't see it, but it's on your face. And so it's a double-edged thing that we have to keep in the balance when we encounter customs that we don't necessarily agree with, or that we are seeing as being barriers of entry into this relationship or into this enterprise that I want to be a part of. And so, with that said, though, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with saying something like, look, I would prefer as a father, hypothetical. I would prefer as a father, because I'm from Bangladesh, that my daughter marry a Bengali, because it's going to make life easier. There's nothing wrong with, as a mother, to say, look, I'm Egyptian, I prefer that my son marry an Egyptian woman. It's just going to make life easier. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's true. It is true, and my wife mentioned that earlier. It is true. It does make life easier. It does make compatibility more of a reality. But that's fundamentally different from saying, where I come from, we don't marry black folks. You understand? That's a completely different tone, different spirit of what's actually being said. Where I come from, men don't lift a dish in the house. And I, as the mother-in-law, future prospective mother-in-law, telling my perhaps future daughter-in-law, listen, I better not be in this house and see my son lifting a dish. That's not how we do it. Those are fundamentally different things. And so we have to asabiya, tribalism, and this extremism, right, in one's attachment to one's ways and customs. We have to be very careful, inshallah ta'ala.
Yeah, inshallah. And the Prophet he retained practices of the pre-Islamic Arabs that were beneficial, or we should say, Allah retained them, and His Messenger retained them, if they were beneficial. So we should never have a perspective, because, you know, it's easy when we talk about, you know, the times of Jahiliyyah, it's easy to think that that sort of applies to literally everything about pre-Islamic Arabia. When it doesn't, it's more so a broad statement. They were ignorant of Islam, they didn't have Islam. And so because of that, there were lots of things that they didn't do correctly. But there were certainly things that they did do that were retained because they were good. Even, you know, one thing I can think about is this concept of generosity, right? Of generosities, particularly when it comes to hosting. That, you know, there was a way in which pre-Islamic Arabs were generous that Islam deemed, one, the spirit of it was good, but also that it could go too far. So, you know, so we're not going to slaughter all of our animals when the guest comes, because what about your kids? And what about tomorrow? But yes, the spirit of wanting to be exceedingly generous and kind and welcoming, we're going to retain that. We're just going to shape it in a way that is more reasonable, but we're not going to strip that from you. But the Prophet ﷺ, he said regarding something called Hadith al-Fudul, which was this pre-Islamic pact to where various tribes agreed to protect people who were victims of injustice, no matter what tribe they came from. Because again, right, they had Asadiya, so if someone from a different tribe was hurt or injured, then sometimes people just wouldn't care because they cared about their own, they didn't care about others. But there was something called Hadith al-Fudul that they developed, which did away with that. It was an attempt to do away with that, to say no, it doesn't matter what tribe you came from. If you were a victim of injustice, then you should be served and you should be helped. And the Prophet had said,